Hello. So today's discussion will be on nominalism, William of Ockham, and his theory of universals. So William of Ockham was a medieval philosopher and theologian, specifically a Franciscan theologian and philosopher from a small village in Surrey, England. He's known for Occam's razor and nominalism. Now, what is Occam's razor? Quite simply, it's about the simplest explanation. So the razor would be taking away or shaving away unnecessary explanations. And the simplest explanation is preferred, not complex. So you don't need to explain more than is necessary, and that the simplest explanation is probably the one that's true. So that's where the razor comes in. So instead of having a metaphysics where you have 10 arguments or explanations for something, instead you could probably do away with some arguments or explanations. And so we'll see where this is put into practice when we're talking about universals, the existence of universal essences or common natures. Now, nominalism. What is nominalism? Nominalism is this idea or understanding that all signs represent individual things. There are no such things in the world, such as universal signs. It's in the name only that it is a matter of language and convention that any discussion or topic of universals that are outside of the mind or have its own existence is really just language or the name that we give it. But in order to have this discussion of universals, we have to go to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, being Plato's student, had some agreements with Plato, had some disagreements. Plato did believe in universals, that there are such things as universal forms or essences, and that they can exist outside the body, exist outside the mind, that it has its own existence of its own. Now, Aristotle agreed with Plato on the forms, but that you cannot exist, you can't have the forms exist outside of matter. And that's where this understanding of body and soul comes in, and that the forms exist, but they don't exist without matter. So Aristotle, in the book of Metaphysics, talks about being. And when we talk about being, there are several meanings that we can give to being. And they all have a central reference to one nature and are not entirely different things that happen to have the same name for Aristotle. That there are various meanings of being. The primary beings, modify primary beings, way to becoming a being. So it's important to understand Aristotle's understanding of change, of everything in the universe going through change and constantly changing from one thing to another, from becoming to becoming, from being to becoming, from potentiality to actuality. And it's important to understand Aristotle's theory of substances, that a substance, that which is called a substance most strictly, primarily, and most of all, is that which is neither said of a subject nor in a subject. So for Aristotle, there are substances out there that are not a matter of just a name that we give it, that just exist in our mind, or that it's a creation of our society or culture, our understanding, but that there are things that exist outside of us that have matter and form. And so Aristotle has what we call categories, or different ways to distinguish things. So he does include substance in there, an individual thing or entity. There's the quantity, a group of things, quality, affirming, denying, contradiction, relation, location, time, posture, possession, action, passion. That these are different ways to distinguish beings or substances, that there's different meanings when we're talking about being, that we're not just giving a name for them. Certainly, we are using our language to describe different ways to distinguish things, but that they do have a nature of their own, and that Aristotle was a proponent of universal, but that they're abstractions from matter and they're not existing in their own world like a Platonic form. So for William of Ockham, does not agree with this understanding of universal essences that have its own nature. And as a nominalist, all signs represent individual things. There's no such thing in the world as universals. It's in the name only. It's what we give it. Now, a realist would say that there are universal essences that have a real common nature existing in individuals. And Plato would be a realist, and Aristotle would be a realist, that they accept this notion of universal essences, a common nature that is not just in the name only. So for the nominalist, nothing real in themselves, nothing in common but the name. For a realist, universals exist not just in the name, but as an actual entity that have a common nature. For example, man is a universal concept that is applied to all man. Every man is an animal. So this is not just the name that we give it, but that we can, through abstractions, through logical deductions and syllogisms, abstract from a common thing such as human nature, every man is an animal, and say that there is such thing as a universal concept that is not just a name, but they do have an existence that is real. That's where you get realist. So when we think of concepts, we think of ideas. So no universal concepts outside the mind, but they are names that we apply to things, and that we order and classify things, which become categories for William of Ockham. So concepts such as animal, or man as an animal, a rational animal, a human nature, these are not universal concepts that exist outside of our mind, but these are the names that we apply to things. We order, we classify them as humans, and they become categories. They're not categories of their own. And in proving this, Ockham has his understanding of various senses of the term. As Aristotle had various ways of talking about being, well, let's talk about the ways we can actually speak of something. Let's start with term. There's three kinds of terms. There's the simple terms, such as spoken, written, conceptual. And that these are different ways to understand terms. So when we apply a term such as man, right? There's the spoken language that we use. There's the written and the conceptual, and the concepts that we give are mental concepts, but they're not concepts that exist and have a nature outside of the human mind and language. So now we have to distinguish between universals and particulars and individuals. Universals are all members of a class of things. Particulars are some members, and individuals are only one member of a class. So these are the various ways we can use the term and see what universal means as opposed to particulars and individual things. Now, Ockham does give a good argument for nominalism. Ockham states, no universal is a particular substance, numerically one. For if this were the case, then it would follow that Socrates is universal. For if no good reason why one substance should be a universal rather than another. Therefore, no particular substance is universal. Every substance is numerically one and a particular. For every substance is either one thing and not many things, or it is any things. Now, if a substance is one thing and not many, then it is numerically one. So Ockham, in breaking this down, a universal is one in number, cannot exist in many singulars. If a universal exists as many singulars, then it's no longer one in number. So all things such as trees are different, not the same. They're not one in many universals, but only many, name only, that we group together through language. So it would follow, according to Ockham, that if Socrates is universal, there's no good reasons why one substance should be a universal rather than another. That Socrates is one, and there could be other Socrates out there, right? There's man, but Socrates as an individual man exists one in number, but cannot exist in many singulars. So it's not a universal, but rather it is through a particular, and we group them together. We group these names together through language. Now, let's get more into details on particulars, what Ockham means on particulars. First, it should be noted that the term particular has two senses. In one sense, a particular is that which is one and not many. Those who hold that universal is a certain quality residing in the mind, which is predicable of many, not suppositing for itself, of course, but for the many of which it is predicated, must grant that, in this sense of the word, every universal is a particular, just as a word, even if convention makes it common, is a particular. The intention of the soul signifying many is numerically one thing, a particular. For although it signifies many things, it is nonetheless one thing and not many. So there's no universals. There's particulars that we group together and we call them universals, but it is one thing and not many. In another sense, so there's two senses, right, that particular is used. In one sense of the word, another sense, we use particular to mean that which is one and not many, and which cannot function as a sign of many. Taking particular in this sense, no universal is a particular. Since every universal is capable of signifying many and of being predicate of many, thus, if we take the term universal to mean that which is not one in number, as many do, then I want to say that nothing is universal. One could, of course, abuse the expression and say that a population constitutes a single universal because it is not one, but many. So we can say, okay, a population constitutes a single universal because we're grouping people together. But what they really are particular things, particular human beings, right? That is one thing, and it's not many. So by convention, we make them common and categorize them as particulars to universals, but they're not universals that exist outside of the name that we give them. So let's go with Ockham and universals. But it should be noted that there are two kinds of universals. So when he talks about, remember, two ways we talk about particulars, now two kinds of universals. Some things are universal by nature. That is, by nature, they are signs predicable of many in the same way that smoke is, by nature, a sign of fire, weeping a sign of grief, and laughter a sign of internal joy. The intention of the soul, of course, is universal by nature. Thus, no substance outside the soul, nor any accident outside the soul is a universal of this sort. It is of this kind of universal that I shall speak in the following chapters. Other things are universals by convention. Thus, a spoken word, which is numerically one quality, is a universal. It is a sign conventionally appointed for the signification of many things. Thus, since a word is said to be common, it can be called a universal. But notice, it is not by nature, but only by convention that this label applies. So he's saying that this language that we apply to things in common, and then we give it this universal term, but it's not universal metaphysically. It doesn't have a metaphysical universal nature, but instead it's through language that we give, thus talking about nominalism as name only. So concepts such as tree and man share something in common, but not as a universal. Instead, they're named particulars. So particulars exist, universals don't exist. Universals exist through convention, but not through some platonic form in a world that exists outside of us. Universal terms are terms that we apply to things that are not real in themselves. So we don't have this access to reality of these things that are the thing in themselves that exists outside the human mind. The human mind has have concepts. Through concepts, we can use language, but it is not something that can have an existence that we discover, but rather its existence is, as a universal, comes through language. So that universals don't have an existence outside the mind, but exist as conventional signs of human language. So Ockham gave a number of arguments, a number of reasons for why concepts such as tree and man share something in common. They're one in many, but they're not many things that we can apply and call them universals and have their own nature.